is the belief that African countries should own themselves their strategies. And that has been the rationale behind the creation of what we call now poverty reduction strategies.
It wasn't a press conference, it was an earthquake. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso just rejected a $3 billion IMF debt relief deal, and in doing so, he tore through the illusion that aid equals freedom. The IMF called it forgiveness. Traoré called it theft wrapped in courtesy. The fine print demanded Africa's future, 40% of gold and oil revenues, plus discounted uranium, pledged as collateral for stability. He refused. Not quietly, not cautiously, but with a roar that reached every African capital. Markets fell. Washington froze. Africans cheered. Because this wasn't just about Burkina Faso, it was a warning shot at an empire of debt. And the question that now burns from Lagos to Nairobi is this: what did the IMF really want? And what happens when Africa finally stops selling its tomorrow to pay for its yesterday? Let's find out. It started like a routine financial announcement, one of those carefully worded IMF press releases that usually pass unnoticed by the world, except for a few economists in tailored suits. But this time, the silence didn't last. Within hours of receiving the IMF's proposed $3 billion debt relief package, President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso tore it apart, called it an insult to Africa's dignity, and sent it back without his signature. The shock wasn't about the number. It was about the audacity of the fine print. Behind the polite language of debt forgiveness were clauses that effectively pledged 40% of Burkina Faso's future gold and oil revenues, and even discounted uranium exports to foreign trustees as assurance for repayment stability. It was a modern version of the colonial contract, a deal that looked generous on the surface, but hollowed out sovereignty at its core. For Traoré, this wasn't finance. It was a trap disguised as charity. He didn't mince his words. In a televised statement that spread like wildfire across Africa, he declared that Africa's resources are not collateral for Western comfort. The room fell silent, but the continent erupted. For the first time in decades, an African leader had not only questioned the West's intentions, but he had rejected its money, publicly, deliberately, and without hesitation. Western analysts called it reckless. African youth called it freedom. But what everyone understood instantly was that something seismic had just shifted. The IMF's formula of control, the same formula that had worked for decades in exchange for debt relief, aid, and restructuring, had just met its first immovable obstacle in Ouagadougou. In the days that followed, financial markets reacted exactly as expected. The CFA franc, still tied to the euro, wobbled. European bond traders whispered about sovereign risk contagion. France issued a muted statement urging dialogue. Washington remained cautious, hinting that cooperation must continue for regional stability. But on African social media, the reaction was nothing short of euphoric. Hashtags like #AfricaIsNotCollateral and #HandsOffOurGold began trending across multiple countries. It wasn't just solidarity with Traoré, it was identification. Africans recognized the pattern because they'd lived it. Debt relief followed by deeper dependence. And that's what made this moment different. It wasn't about one country rejecting a loan. It was about a continent rejecting a mindset. The belief that poverty requires permission and sovereignty must be negotiated. The symbolism cut deep. The West called the deal historic. But to Traoré, it was history repeating itself, the same colonial script rewritten in financial language. For decades, institutions like the IMF have offered reforms that forced African nations to privatize their assets, cut subsidies, and open markets to foreign capital, all in the name of progress. Yet those reforms hollowed out local industries, kept economies export-dependent, and ensured that the continent's wealth flowed outward faster than aid flowed in. Traoré's rejection was not about one deal. It was about breaking a cycle. A $3 billion loan was never the prize. Sovereignty was. By saying no, he drew a red line between assistance and exploitation, between relief and repossession. And that line is now visible from Bamako to Accra. But that brings us to the bigger question. What exactly makes these relief deals so dangerous for Africa? Why does something that sounds like help always end up feeling like a trap? To understand that, we must step beyond the headlines and into the machinery of modern finance itself, where debt forgiveness often hides its true cost. Because the real story isn't just about what Traoré refused, it's about what Africa has been unknowingly accepting for decades. When President Traoré rejected that glittering $3 billion offer, he wasn't simply turning down a financial deal, he was exposing a system built to look like salvation, but designed to sustain dependence. The kind that Africa has been looped into for over half a century, dressed up in new buzzwords every decade. Debt restructuring, poverty reduction, stability mechanism. Each time, the faces at the negotiating tables change, but the architecture never does. So how does this machine actually work? It begins with crisis management, or more accurately, crisis creation. When a nation is struggling under the weight of debt, often debt accumulated from colonial-era projects or post-independence loans that did little to industrialize the country, international institutions swoop in as rescuers. They promise relief, but every promise comes with conditionalities. Policies the government must implement before receiving aid. These conditions are never neutral. They are structured to open local economies to global capital and guarantee repayment through resources or revenue streams. The IMF doesn't say, "Give us your gold." It says, "Ensure repayment stability through revenue guarantees." It doesn't demand oil directly. It demands that the government secure collateral through future export earnings. On paper, this sounds like accountability. In practice, it means locking Africa's natural wealth into financial contracts controlled offshore. The country becomes compliant by law, not by force. And the genius of it? It all sounds technical, boring enough that citizens don't notice. Few will ever read a 90-page memorandum written in economic jargon. But buried inside those clauses are commitments that mortgage the future. Agreements that can last decades, binding not just one administration, but generations to come. That's why Traoré's rejection struck a nerve. He didn't just refuse the deal. He refused the grammar of control, the subtle financial language that has kept Africa obedient without needing troops or coups. Because every line of that contract, every safeguard clause, is a thread in a web that keeps the continent spinning inside the same orbit, producing raw materials, exporting them cheaply, and importing expensive finished goods. It's not just the IMF, of course. The World Bank, Paris Club creditors, and a rotating circle of development agencies all play parts in this orchestra. Each time they announce relief, it comes with an invoice disguised as reform. Sell state assets, deregulate trade, cut public spending. The result? Schools close, food prices rise, industries die, but debt ratios improve, satisfying international scorecards that measure fiscal health, not human welfare. This isn't new. The roots go back to the 1980s structural adjustment era, when African nations were told to privatize everything from power grids to water utilities in exchange for debt relief. It was supposed to stimulate efficiency. Instead, it hollowed out the public sector and handed essential industries to foreign corporations. Decades later, the same pattern repeats, this time under the language of collateral guarantees and sustainability bonds. Different century, same chains. Traoré's statement pulled back the curtain. When he said Africa's resources were not collateral, he wasn't being poetic. He was describing how the machine works. In the IMF's framework, the continent's minerals aren't just commodities, they are insurance policies for the comfort of creditors. The more Africa exports, the safer investors feel. The less Africa controls, the more predictable the system becomes. And yet, what makes this moment revolutionary is that Traoré didn't simply denounce the system. He understood it. He had studied it, dissected it, and realized that the key to breaking free isn't outrage, it's refusal. Because this machine doesn't collapse under protest, it collapses when a nation simply stops feeding it. But here's where the real tension begins. If Africa stops playing by these financial rules, if one nation's refusal inspires others, what happens next? Can a continent that has been financially engineered for dependency truly rebuild itself from within? That's not a hypothetical question. It's the next chapter in this story. Because what Traoré has done is not just say no. He has forced the world to confront what Africa's independence looks like when it's no longer for sale. And to understand how he plans to build that independence, We need to look inside the architecture of his revolution, the system he's building to replace the one he just defied. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. When Ibrahim Traoré tore up that IMF proposal, he didn't just create a vacuum, he created a question: what replaces the machine once you stop feeding it? Because refusing debt deals is one thing, but surviving without them is another. It's here that Traoré's real plan begins to unfold, a plan that goes far beyond a single financial rejection and dives into the anatomy of independence itself. The key to his approach lies in re-engineering Burkina Faso's internal economy, so that survival is no longer dependent on external credit lines. For decades, countries across Africa were told that prosperity required integration into global markets, that development depended on foreign loans, external investors, and imported expertise. Traoré has flipped that model upside down. His blueprint starts from the inside: produce what you consume, refine what you extract, and trade what you own. The first pillar of this transformation is resource sovereignty. In the past 2 years, Traoré's government has forced a silent revolution through Burkina Faso's mining sector. Instead of allowing multinational companies to extract raw gold and ship it out unprocessed, his administration has mandated that a portion of all production must now be refined domestically. The country's first state-run gold refinery, a facility capable of processing hundreds of kilograms per day, isn't just an economic project. It's a declaration that the value chain must begin and end on African soil. Gold now circulates through national reserves before any ounce leaves the border. The symbolism is immense. Wealth is no longer extracted. It's retained, recirculated, and reinvested. The second pillar is regional self-reliance. Traoré knows that one nation cannot stand alone against a global financial system that feeds on fragmentation. That's why Burkina Faso joined forces with Mali and Niger to form the Alliance of Sahel States, a regional bloc designed to replace the old colonial alliances with cooperative sovereignty. The three nations are building shared defense structures, energy grids, and transport corridors that bypass the dependency routes drawn by their former colonizers. Instead of importing refined petroleum from Europe, the AES is exploring joint oil refining projects and mutual gold trade settlements that use local currencies or commodities rather than dollars or euros. This is not just diplomacy, it's architecture. Traoré envisions an Africa that trades across its borders without asking permission from financial gatekeepers. His dream echoes the early vision of Thomas Sankara, Burkina Faso's revolutionary hero. But where Sankara's movement was crushed by isolation, Traoré is trying to anchor his in networks of solidarity that cannot be easily sanctioned. The third pillar is strategic partnerships beyond the West. Traoré's refusal of the IMF doesn't mean he's rejecting global engagement. It means he's choosing the terms. In recent months, Ouagadougou has deepened talks with Russia for energy cooperation, China for infrastructure investment, and Turkey for defense manufacturing. None of these partners offer free lunches, but their deals are built on exchange, not subjugation. Instead of mortgaging gold for credit, Burkina Faso trades gold for technology, uranium for infrastructure, and logistics for training. It's transactional, not ideological, and that distinction is critical. Each of these pillars feeds into the same strategic goal: to make Burkina Faso financially self-anchored before seeking any external support. It's a slow, uneven process, but it's rewriting the rules of survival. Because once a nation can produce, refine, and defend what it owns, debt relief becomes irrelevant. Loans lose their leverage. And that's precisely what frightens global creditors: the idea that Africa might become unlendable because it no longer needs to borrow. Yet independence is never free. For every ounce of sovereignty regained, there's retaliation waiting in the shadows, from credit rating downgrades to trade restrictions and media warfare. The West will not quietly watch its financial architecture lose a cornerstone. And that leads to the next question that now looms over Ouagadougou. What happens when resistance meets retaliation? Because history shows that every African leader who tried to escape the financial leash, from Nkrumah to Sankara, paid a price. And Traoré knows the blowback is coming. The only question now is, how far will the empire go to punish defiance this time? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. For every revolution, there's retaliation, and Traoré knows that better than anyone. His rejection of the IMF didn't just challenge an institution, it threatened an entire architecture of global influence. When you cut off a predator's food supply, it doesn't retreat, it circles. The signs of resistance were visible almost immediately. Credit rating agencies began murmuring about rising instability. Western newspapers shifted tone, labeling Burkina Faso's leadership militarized populism. Economic analysts warned of regional contagion. It was predictable, the language of soft punishment dressed as financial concern. This isn't new. History shows that when African leaders reject Western economic prescriptions, their countries become targets of engineered scarcity. Suddenly, loans freeze, investors panic, and currencies plummet. Not because the fundamentals changed, but because someone flipped the perception switch. That's how modern control operates, not through direct occupation, but through the manipulation of confidence. And in a system where access to credit equals access to oxygen, the fastest way to suffocate a defiant state is to cut off its credibility. Burkina Faso felt it within days. Foreign banks began tightening currency exchange limits. European partners suspended development talks. French media revived the old tropes of instability, painting the Sahel as a risk zone. It was less analysis and more warning. Defy the system, and you will be isolated. But what the architects of this narrative failed to grasp is that Traoré anticipated this storm long before it arrived. He understood that financial isolation was inevitable, and so he designed a survival economy. While Western commentators speculated about sanctions, Traoré was busy strengthening internal mechanisms of resilience. Local trade networks, agricultural cooperatives, state-backed mining enterprises, and new alliances with non-Western powers. Instead of importing finished goods from France, Burkina Faso began sourcing from African neighbors and Asian partners. The goal was simple. If they shut the door to the West, the country should already have windows open to the South and East. The most strategic countermeasure, however, wasn't economic. It was psychological. Traoré used the backlash to consolidate national unity. Every attack from Western media became proof of what he had been warning about all along, that Africa's struggle was never about aid, but about autonomy. His speeches stopped sounding defensive and started sounding prophetic. The more he was criticized abroad, the more revered he became at home. In that sense, isolation became currency, and he spent it wisely. Still, beneath the defiance lies a more complex challenge: endurance. Resistance alone doesn't sustain economies. Burkina Faso must now balance the moral victory of independence with the material reality of survival. There will be shortages, logistical bottlenecks, and pressure from elites with foreign loyalties. Some neighboring states, still tied to Western financial systems, may even be persuaded to destabilize cooperation within the alliance of Sahel states. The empire may have lost its grip, but it hasn't lost its reach. This is where the story turns critical. Because the IMF's strength was never just in lending money, it was in controlling the narrative of necessity. As long as African governments believed that global credit was indispensable, the IMF never had to intervene. It only had to wait. Traoré shattered that illusion. But the next phase is harder, proving that sovereignty is not only honorable, it's sustainable. So the real question now is not whether Burkina Faso can resist the IMF. The question is whether it can replace the IMF with new systems of trade, new financial partners, and new instruments of solidarity that make the old architecture obsolete. Because the empire's retaliation only matters if the alternatives are weak. And that's where the story heads next, into the quiet, determined construction of a new financial order where Africa writes its own terms, and the era of begging for relief finally gives way to one of building real power. The retaliation from the old system was fierce, but Traoré never intended to fight forever. He intended to replace it. His vision, quietly forming beneath the noise of sanctions and slander, is not just about Burkina Faso surviving alone. It's about building an Africa that no longer negotiates its freedom in foreign boardrooms. Because he understands that true sovereignty doesn't come from rejecting the IMF, it comes from making the IMF irrelevant. This is the stage where the story transforms from rebellion into reconstruction. After defiance comes design. Traoré has started laying the groundwork for a new African financial model, one that draws its power from unity rather than dependency. The nucleus of that model lies within the alliance of Sahel states, its political and economic brotherhood with Mali and Niger. Together, these nations have begun quietly drafting what they call the Sahel Financial Charter, a document envisioned to coordinate resource-backed trade, stabilize local currencies, and pave the way for a regional payment system independent of the West. This isn't fiction, it's strategy. By settling trade using gold reserves, local currencies, or strategic commodities instead of dollars or euros, the AES hopes to reduce exposure to global market manipulation. It's the financial version of what their armies already achieved on the battlefield, expelling foreign bases and asserting territorial control. Only this time, the war is economic, and the victory will be measured in ownership, not artillery. The second element of this blueprint is the pivot to multipolar partnerships. Traoré's government is in talks with BRICS institutions, particularly the New Development Bank, to explore alternative funding for infrastructure and agriculture. The logic is simple. If the IMF ties money to obedience, then Africa should seek partners who tie it to production. The NDB's focus on tangible development rather than fiscal conditionality fits perfectly into this approach. It allows nations like Burkina Faso to borrow against potential, not punishment, to invest in factories, refineries, and transport systems instead of surrendering them as collateral. Meanwhile, within the African Union, conversations are shifting too. The African Monetary Fund, once seen as symbolic, is gaining traction as countries grow disillusioned with Bretton Woods institutions. Traoré's defiance has breathed life into these dormant ambitions, inspiring discussions about a Pan-African payment and settlement system that could allow inter-African transactions without Western intermediaries. What was once an idea on conference tables now feels like an urgent necessity. But Traoré's most radical contribution isn't in policy or paperwork, it's in psychology. By rejecting the IMF, he has broken a mental chain that was harder to cut than any financial one. The belief that Africa must ask for permission to prosper. His act has reframed debt not as destiny, but as a choice, a reversible one. Across the continent, young economists and activists are debating new ideas once dismissed as impractical. Gold-backed regional currencies, cooperative energy markets, and even continental digital banks owned by African states. What used to be dismissed as fantasy now feels like the logical next step. Of course, the path ahead is brutal. Economic liberation means enduring isolation before integration. The West will test every fault line, from internal corruption to regional politics. Some leaders will waver, some will sell out. But movements like this are not built on unanimity. They're built on momentum. And momentum is exactly what Traoré has unleashed. He's no longer just the president of Burkina Faso. He's become the face of a question echoing across the continent. What if Africa finally stopped asking for relief and started demanding respect? If the alliance of Sahel states can stabilize their economies, attract investment from the global south, and build trade routes that connect rather than divide, it will mark the beginning of the first post-IMF Africa. That would not just change African economics, it would rewrite global finance itself. Because once Africa learns to finance Africa, the West loses its last leverage. And in that moment, when no deal comes with a chain, Traoré's defiance will no longer be remembered as rebellion. It will be remembered as the declaration of a new financial independence. Do you think Africa is finally ready to fund itself without asking the West for permission? Let us know in the comment section. If every African leader did what Traoré just did, would the IMF still hold power? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned. Africa.